It's safe to say that Sega will always be famous for its involvement in the 90s console wars. Though we all know that Nintendo ended up winning that war, Sega certainly didn't go down without a fight. Yet, Sega's hardware and IPs began disappearing by the 2000s. Well, not Sonic, of course. Fans from the old days started finding new ways to get their fix of Sega nostalgia. Many would find this through compilation packs on various systems. Some that are pretty decent, and others that are not. The newest installments found on today's generation of consoles is not a bad way to go if you don't feel like investing into retro hardware. Yet, people like myself find it necessary to shell out money on 30-year-old products. There are others who are interested in something of that nature, but don't want to go through the effort of finding an old Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. This is where clone consoles come in. Analogues Mega SG is currently today's best option for playing Sega Genesis, Mega Drive, Sega Master System, or even Game Gear games on a modern television out of the box. There are people out there who are going to argue that the only way to play these games is on original hardware. However, when it comes to your Genesis, your options today for that are limited and/or expensive. In the event that you still have a CRT television that also has composite inputs, that would be red and white for audio and yellow for video. This is the way that most people played in North America. This is an okay option, I guess. Certainly better than RF. However, if you don't want to keep an old crappy TV around just to play your old Sega Genesis games, why not find a newer TV that has both HDMI and composite inputs? For starters, the Genesis didn't have very good composite output in the first place, so there's really not a whole lot you can do about that. If your modern TV only displays in 16:9 widescreen and it can't be forced to 4:3, the result will stretch your games, making everything seem distorted and just wrong. This doesn't bother some people, and many people can just look past it. The Genesis does not natively support S-Video, but it does support RGB, which is even better. So back to the original problem. American TVs do not have RGB inputs. RGB is more commonly found on a European or Japanese television, as well as expensive PVM monitors. Recently, there are companies that have been making RGB to HDMI converters. However, unless you fork a few $100s for the proper converters like a Framemeister or the OSSC, you're still going to have some problems. I have a very cheap converter for my Sega Genesis. This cost around $50, and ultimately it does display the games with better resolution, and if this was your only option, it really isn't horrible. The games will display at a resolution of 720p or 1080p, but unless you can force your TV's ratio, you'll be forced to use 16:9. This also results in a ton of blur when the screen is scrolling. You may also experience input lag on certain games, which for maybe Sonic or whatever, that's no big deal. But for a game like Thunder Force 4, where inputs need to be precise, that's an issue. The Mega SG, priced at $189.99 before shipping, this is going to be the best way to play your old Sega Genesis games. It's around the size of an SNES Classic, and it has an identical setup in the back. One USB hub for power and an HDMI output. Well, one might ask, why not just get an SNES Classic for $89, mod it to play Sega games, and save the rest of the money for something else? And to be completely honest, this isn't a horrible way to go either, but there are some key differences. The Mega SG is built with FPGA chips. I'm not an expert on these types of chip hardwares and things like that, but essentially, the difference is, this console will emulate what the Model 1 Genesis hardware could do, instead of being a piece of hardware that runs ROMs via software emulation. I definitely could notice a huge difference playing games like Super Hang-On, for example. On the first levels, when using the SNES Classic, you'll notice it can't handle the draw distance like a Genesis could. These bushes and other items stick out of the background when scrolling up on the SNES. But on the Mega SG, it's smooth as butter. Here's the same scene running on a Genesis Model 2. Everything seems much smoother, and the scrolling from screen to screen doesn't result in blurry sprites. On top of that, the Mega SG gives you tons of options for display and graphics. When you go through the menus, you'll find several options. There's a resolutions option. This can get you all the way up to 1080p and 60Hz. And if you're playing your PAL games, which are compatible on the Mega SG, you can switch down to 50Hz. There's also a way of adjusting the width and the height. Whether you choose to go for the 4:3 or the square resolution, either one's a good choice. Just depends on your own preference. You can also go and check out the scalers. I'm not the hugest fan of some of these, but the last two seem to be okay if that's what you're into. I do recommend looking into the interpolation functions. If your game is shimmering, then you might want to turn these on. As someone who messes with sound for a living, I really enjoy being able to play with all the different square and sine wave functions. I see how this could be beneficial for someone who DJs using this type of music. In general, the default setup is good, and I don't recommend playing with the ladder effect too much. There is an option to turn dithering on and off. Dithering was used in these games to help give you the perception of transparencies. If you look at the lights here on Streets of Rage 2, you'll see they are all blocky and almost look like a net. This was to help your CRT see it as a solid color back in the day and give you the illusion of a transparency. I like leaving it the way it is. There's also all types of customizing you can do, going on from the font to the LED power light and more. The Mega SG also has a SD card slot. This is to help with firmware updates. I also highly recommend buying the 8-bit Do wireless controller. It is modeled after the 6-button Sega Saturn controller, and it has the best D-pad I've ever played with. I bought a second one immediately after my first one.